Yeah, hello everyone. Again to another meeting or training session. ZK Ask the Expert. As always, I'm Robert, consultant and support engineer at Potix at ZK, and we're dealing with customer related questions, prototypes, and bugs and features since 8.5 years already. Last week we were talking about, or just reiterating some of the basics of ZK, how it works under the hood. Today the session will also be quite low level about general navigation, but I hope that also for some of the experienced people on your side, there's something that's maybe helpful or looks convenient, or a feature you might have missed in the past. Or maybe a feature you were looking for, and I can tell you that it's not there, so you can stop searching for it. Yeah, so today we talk about navigation, as requested last session by someone. So I'm always open for suggestions or questions. So come, yeah, keep on asking. Try to find something that is useful for all of us. Okay, so what do we have? We just go directly into the project. So today we talk about navigation. Navigation is there's already two different kinds, like the classical multi-page navigation and a single-page navigation, where you remain on one page. A multi-page navigation is basically the same as in classical application. You open a new URL and ZK will render a new page. If that's intended, that's perfectly fine. ZK will load a new page. It's just not the most efficient way, but you can easily do this by setting links with an href. So you click it and it opens directly, or from server side, you can just send a redirect to the client back so that the client can update the current URL. It will still load a new page. It will discard the old page and continue in a new website. It will download all the resources that ZK needs to load, like the JavaScript files and CSS files, and ideally they're cached on the client side in the browser, so it doesn't cost too much overhead. But still, to keep in mind, it's a new page, it's a new desktop object at server side. I think we go directly into the code. I just have a small example how to do this. I assume everyone is familiar with this topic, because there's not much to say about it. Just open a small multi-page application. Zool file. I have 3 pages, and I can freely navigate between the 2 pages, or between the 3 pages. And if I want to, I can also combine the pages to have some kind of common templates. For example, in the main Zool, I am including the navigation fragment, which is just another Zool file, which is currently commented out. But we start with a simple case. Just add some kind of div that is our top navigation bar, and it contains a few components that will lead to another page. You see there's a button can also be a link. It uses an href to just point to another page, and it will also find out whether it's active or not by a parameter that is passed into this. So it's a very simple way to have a dynamically changing navigation bar that indicates what is the current or that disables the current link, so you don't click it twice. In the main.zool, I simply include this one. It can be done with the apply shadow element or the include component, depending on what you prefer. The include component it creates another div around it and has some specialties. I mentioned them before. So if you have ZK I would recommend apply for this, because it doesn't create extra DOM elements. Otherwise, use include component or a macro. There are many ways I think you will find these. It's not the topic today, just something that helps to build a simple website. I run the project, and the same happens on another page. On the more page, I pass in the string more. On the other page, I pass in the string other, just to have one dynamic part. You could also just generate the whole fragments from Java code, which I'll also demonstrate in the Java example with the composer. Okay, I think it's already running. Just open the browser. We go to our MPA main. It's already here, so no surprise here. We open the main.zool, which displays the content, our navbar, and the main content. And we've seen here just the string main, nothing else. Can be any component here. And when I click the other buttons, it's very quick because it's localhost. It's not a slow network connection. It has no delay. So it looks almost like it's staying on the same page, but in fact, it's really loading whole ZK. You can easily see what this means in the network tab. Just to be clear what's going on, I click something and it's loading a Zool file. The Zool file will just download a new HTML file. It will contain all the components for this page and also all the script elements it needs to download. So we see a bunch of requests in the list. Since I don't use many components, the list is short, but still there's an overhead when reloading a new page. So whenever we go to another page, it just does the same thing again. And you see some of them are quite large, like the ZK WPD. So if this one is not cached, like in my case, I enable the caching right now, it will download again. So be aware that if you do multi-page navigation, that you have the caching enabled, so that you don't have this overhead for every request. Yeah, so this is the simple page. What we can do is in for example, our navigation, we can just replace it with other components. It doesn't really matter. Anything that has an href can be used as to directly click somewhere. So we have same thing now with a link. Could be used in the footer or in a sidebar navigation, wherever you need to place these. I found out when testing this, and you can also use a Navbar component, that there is some specialty about Navbar. Yeah. That if you use the Navbar, the href somehow is not encoded. You have to encode it yourself, so it contains the whole servlet context path. If you don't encode the URL, it will just omit this part here, and then of course doesn't exist. Yeah, maybe it's a bug, maybe a design decision. I need to figure out, just to be aware. And if you use href on nav item directly, you need to encode the URL. But there's an encode function that is available in the core libraries of ZK. And internally, ZK is doing nothing else or nothing different for the href attributes on an A or a button link. So it's just the same functionality usable in a Zool file. Yeah, or what is also very popular is using a Tapbox navigation. But here I already do something different. Here I use server-side navigation. Instead of using the href, I just use a click listener and send a redirect back. Even though this is inline in the Zool file, I think you already know this, or you all know this. The inline listeners are executed at server side in a bean shell interpreter. So it's not ideal for production and demonstration use. It's not good for production use, but for demonstration purposes, this gives always nice, concise examples. And I'll show the same thing in a Java implementation in a second. So the same thing, execution, send redirect. This will already encode the URL. So in most cases, it will encode the URL correctly. In some cases, it's somehow missing. And Same thing here, based on the active page, I determine the selected state in the same way I did here. Instead of disabling, I just mark it as selected. So if we use Tapbox in this case, now we have only the Tapbox. The Tapbox don't need the content. It's just another way that is clickable. But there's a small difference here. If we click the preserve log, we will see that the request is first going to the server and the response will tell the browser where to navigate. So this is a way where you can decide on server side whether the navigation should happen or not. Maybe you can tell the user instead, you have some unsaved data, please save first before you go there. Or are you sure you want to leave the page? That's something you can decide in these kind of listeners and then redirect. I'll show what this means. So here it says, here's my ZKAUs, always these AJAX requests. When I click one of these tabs, it sends the on-click to the server and also an on-select event, but I don't know which one do I use, on-click. And in the response, Chrome forgot to record what happens in the response. I just try again, click another one. Sometimes it records. And I think because navigation happens so quickly, we don't see the response right now, but trust me, the response will contain some kind of command that says send redirect to the new URL. Then you see the new URL is being loaded. And then there is another request that will clean up the old desktop. You see here, there's an RM desktop. Sorry, I just asked my workmates to stop shifting the chairs. Oh, by the way, do you hear the background noise? No problem. Okay, it's already finished. So, yeah, simple multi-page navigation, nothing new. And as said, directly in the browser without the server-side round trip, or with the server-side round trip, basically any event listener can be used to send a redirect. And if we want to do everything at server-side, no ZUL file, just dynamically, we can use a composer. And inside the composer, I just iterate over my list of navigation names, whatever you call them, page names. And I create a button for each of these. And the button will just set the target URL. And then it will say, in the first case, set href, but I could also set, instead of href, I'll just do this one, do this example first. We check that the href works in the same way. We reload the page. Now we are back to buttons. So we go directly to a new page. We see there is, well, I'll filter only AJAX and doc, and clear the logs and reload. And we click main. You see it's going directly there, no AJAX response in the background. The only other request is the cleanup, the RM desktop request. You see these are called ping. They are not really requests that do something. They only tell ZK at server side to clean up the previous page. So that's the simple case for the URL directly. And in the same way, you can just add an event listener and set a redirect URL. Of course, import the class, recompile. And we reload the browser again. And now this time I click it. Before I click I clear, we see it's sending two requests. I want to clean up the old desktop and one that contains, well, it should have contained the response that shows, that tells ZK to navigate to the next page, and then it's opening the next page. So that's basically all you need to know about multi-page navigation. It has a few benefits. For example, if you go back, it just works out of the box because the URL is already changing. And when the URL changes, you will get exactly to the page that you were before. So in this case, you already have back button handling built in because that's what the browser does naturally. Things get more complicated when doing single page navigation, because that's what the browser is not doing by default. It's something that needs to be added with JavaScript. ZK does most of the things here. I think my examples don't contain any custom JavaScript this time. Just covering the basics, and then I show you a bit more complex example with all the features I enabled here. So let's see, did I miss anything? So we have href, execution, send redirect, any kind of event listener can be used, button, blah, blah, blah. So nothing new. When we do single page navigation, we stay on the same page. But what we do is we replace or update the contents dynamically, which has the benefits that ZK doesn't need to re-download all the client engine and all the CSS, and will just stay the same and just delete some DOM elements and create some new DOM elements in the browser. And we can use, for example, components like include or apply with a dynamic URL. We can set the URL, for example, via MVVM or MVC or ZScript inline, just to switch between Zool files at a certain point. Or we can use Java directly to just call create components with a Zool file as a path, and then components are created directly. Internally, include and apply are doing the same thing. So the basics are create components, and if you want something that integrates into a Zool file, you can pick one of these options. And also this allows dynamic nested navigation at arbitrary levels. You just include a div or you include a Zool file that has another div, and this div or window or whatever component contains more includes or has a composer on the Java side that calls create components dynamically based on whatever condition you decide. So if we look into the simple example, it's the basics. There is my inline ZScript, as said, is not JavaScript. This is server-side bean shell script. It's just two Java methods. That could be as well methods on your composer that use the two techniques I'm showing today. So either changing the source attribute of an include or creating components directly. Yeah, in this case, I have a let's look at the content. I have a content include or a content div for both techniques. Can call them main content, main wrapper. There are many names, so these doesn't really matter. Just something you can reference in your composers, or something you can put your MVVM data bindings to the source attribute to update it. And you could also use apply here. I don't cover it again because it's the same technique. So content include. So what does it do? When I say navigate by include, it will navpass add subpage if subpage unable. I need to think what I did here. It was yesterday. I'm just building a list of path elements because in this example I have one nested level. Just look at what we just look at what it does. Go to single page application basics.zool. I have these two examples. One is navigating by include and one is navigating by create components. And if I click main, for example, it will include the content main. I made the example a bit more complex so we can look at something more special. So the main.zool is just this one here. Sorry, that's MPA. That's the wrong one. I just closed the windows I don't want to see right now. So basics, and it's including the pages here, for example, main.zool. Now it's just a window that displays the current path. And this is my argument that I pass into the page. And basically any information can be passed into it, any kind of Java object, because it's happening at server side. It doesn't need to be converted into a string. It's just any information you need for the page to render. You pass it in as execution arguments. And when using an include component, you set the dynamic property before changing the source URL. And then these dynamic properties will be the arguments for the new Zool file that's being rendered. So what I do is I set the source to null this is important if you navigate to the same page again. Sometimes you want to reload the same page. It will not refresh if the URL doesn't change. And I warn you, don't do this. Param equals 1, 2, 3 and change the parameter. If you do this with an include, it will switch into this weird defer mode. We have too many questions about this one, so I just say it right away. Don't do this. Set it to null first and load it again. If you need to reload the same URL, then it runs in instant mode. Yeah, it's tempting to do this, but it's just doing something you don't expect, and it's a reason for many support calls we received in the past. I think most of you know already, because sooner or later you will have come across it. Just to be sure, don't do it. Now, then it's better to use create components. It's just the same number of lines of code, just more direct, and you don't have these limitations or these side effects, because include component is also allowing to include other than Zool files. So it does something when the URL changes, something different, and has to run them in a separate request include mode. It's just weird or different. So I build up my path information. I pass it in as a property and update the Zool, the source element. And now if we flip to another page, we see there's only a single request going to the server. And what it contains is it removes the contents of the include and adds new elements into it. Now, previously it was, here's the current path other. And if I switch to main, it returns with the information about main. Or if I go to the more page, it goes to the more page. And now I have already shown, I'm already showing some nested navigation that we'll look into more later. If you, no, we can look into it right now because it's the same thing. If you, for example, if I click to some more, you see I put more information as the path information, so I can also tell the nested page to open a specific a tab. Now, if you have a tab navigation inside an include, you can flip the tab easily by just including this page in a different way. Or if I want to go back to main, this one only works in the other example, so not in the static basic example. Okay, so how does this do it if where are the buttons? Here are the buttons, yeah. So the buttons are easy. They just pass in 1 or 2 parameters into my Navbar include function, which is basically the 2 path elements. Could be a list, can be a tree-like object. If you have multiple nested panels that need information in a tab box, you can be very creative here. Just pass information in your on-click listener, which again can be a proper event listener in your composer of your navigation. We will see this. And it's very, very similar if we do the other approach by creating components directly. I just pass in the same information. And I really do the same thing. I just compose my list of path elements. So there's 1 or 2 elements in the path. So it's adding the page or the subpage. And what I do is I clear the children directly of my content div, and I create components into the content div based on a dynamic Zool URL. And the parameters I pass in as a simple hash map can be any number of parameters that have a string key and a Java arbitrary object value. And here it's just a list of strings. Can be a list of your page info objects that contain maybe title information, icon information, maybe even information about what is the current account number that needs to be displayed on the account page. You can be very creative here in what you pass into this map. So very easy way to load a new Zool file in a single method inside a common container. Yeah, I think these are roughly the base. So if I do this on the bottom, I just reload the page, so we see it's still doing the same thing. Now I click a button and it switches between two pages. Now here other, and this was the main. The problem we see here is back navigation doesn't work anymore. We go directly to the MPA, to the multi-page application we've been before. Since everything happened inside the single page, it doesn't have any history. So we look into a more complex example now, how to manage the history. I hope I'm not skipping any points. So my ideas were, yeah, you can use apply or include components. You can create components directly. Apply is especially useful for MVVM if you just apply with a dynamic template URL. So you can say template URI equals, and then you say add load. Oops, sorry. Add load, and then you use your view model. View model dot some page URL, and whenever you notify change, this one, the apply will reload the content. And the same also works with the source URL of an include. There are a few hoops if you want to set it to null first and then set it back to something else. So if this is a problem, get back to our support. I can easily help. It needs to be done in 2 steps. Otherwise, MVVM will only apply the last change, and then the include component finds out, oh, it didn't change, so I won't reevaluate the content. So it's a bit less convenient with include. That's why we have the apply element. Create component is the most flexible and the most basic API. So any of the above will just use this under the hood. And create components is also a bit more flexible. It has ways to create components from dynamic Zool. A Zool string can be a pre-parsed page. What else can it be? I forgot. It has more overloaded methods. There are many things you can do here. Yes, and you have the option to do dynamic nested navigation by only changing a specific or by any kind of component. Like nested includes, nested applies. Maybe use a tab box for sub navigation. It's very common. A card layout if you want to build some kind of wizard. Just as your application requires. So what we said is single application, the classical problem is there's no history because it's a single page. The URL doesn't change by itself. I already mentioned for multi-page applications, it just happens out of the box. So there's nothing else to do. History just works. In a single page, we have to build a history ourselves. Somehow these 2 topics, bookmarkable URLs and back button handling, are somewhat related, but they can be used. One can be used without the other. If you don't care about the history, you can still generate bookmarkable URLs. If you don't care about bookmarkability of your URLs, you can still keep a history to get back, even if the user uses the URL later. Has no meaning. It maybe has a meaning while he's still in the current session or in his current browser session. So the key is for these bookmarkable URLs is to encode some kind of navigation information inside the URL, the current page, the current path of the page, maybe an account ID or a customer ID, whatever you need to recover the state from a URL. And also, if you need back button handling, you just put this information into the history. So when the user presses the back button, the information is sent back to the server and you can recover the previous state. Techniques to use are path, dynamic paths, URL parameters. If you don't have any fancy path handling, if you don't care about nice URLs, just use parameters. They work out of the box. That's a really easy thing to do. The URLs just get ugly. The Uri fragment is something special. It's these hash code. These are not really part of the URL sent to the server, but ZK has for legacy browsers. It has this handling to have some information in the URL that is part of the browser history, but you remain on the same page. So if you only change the hash code of an URL, of a URL, it does not go to a new, or doesn't load a new page automatically. So if you hit the back button, it stays on the page and changes the URL in the browser. And then ZK will detect the change of the URL fragment and send an event to the server. You can do this with desktop set bookmark and the bookmark changed event. But since this is legacy, and I hope no one has to use IE10 anymore, and then use some modern features, so it's hopefully obsolete. But if there's a problem, it's still there. It's not deprecated, or it's not bound to be removed. It's just, I think, unnecessary. So I'll focus on the nice things we have. I'll just stay on this side. Yeah, and which is the browser's history API, which has these nice methods: push history state, replace history state, and an event on history pop state. What it does is push history state will execute something at the client side in JavaScript and just update the URL. That's a feature in the browser to change the URL without loading a new page. It just looks different to the user. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are limits to what you can do. So you can't just make your page look like google.com. So you can't output any arbitrary URLs. You need to stay within the boundaries of your application. But that's what we want. We want to make URLs that work in our application. And push history state will add a new item to the browser stack. Let's just show you what it means. So if you right click here, you see the history. And whenever you call push element, it will add a new item to this list. And when you click back, it will go back to the previous one. So push state is to add a new item. Replace state is to keep the same item right now, but only change the URL. So if the user goes back, they will still go back to their previous page, but the current page will look nicer. It will look like it has a nicer URL. Maybe you want to, for aesthetic reasons, hide some information from the URL. Don't use this to hide critical or sensitive information. It will still be sent to the client if the user has this has a link. So this is only for aesthetical reasons, or to make the URL bookmarkable in case you have some extra information. But once the user was logged in, so you say add some kind of session ID. So if the user comes back later with the same URL, you can use the session ID and load some data from your database to recover the moment when the user left, or when the user last saved. So it could be anything like this. And on history pop state is the event when the user presses the back button. The server side will receive this event, and you can change the current page. Yeah, it feels quite natural and easy to use. There are always a few, or in the past there were some browser inconsistencies. I haven't encountered them recently, so I hope this is maybe just nice. Sometimes we maybe have nice things. So what I did here, so I just closed the basics and the main.zool, and now we go into the more complicated case. Now I made an index.zool. Now it's getting dynamic. We have a navigation composer which will deal with our navigation, and we have an index composer which will render the current page. The current page content. I use create components here, but as we learned, this is just a replacement for any other technique to render components dynamically. Can be an include, can be an apply element, can be a dynamic part of a Zool file with a load binding. So you don't have to use this one. It's just the method I used here. It's in the end, it's just a normal composer in ZK. You can use a selector composer for this and just bind via a variable to your content diff or your content include, and use the component specific APIs to change this if you want to. But I would say this one is the easiest thing to use, the most basic method, and it just has no surprises. It just does what you want. Yeah, I clear the children. and do something new of the and append something new based on my current new page URL or page path. So what does it do? I go to my spa. It will, because I didn't put any Zool file, it will default to index.zool. So it already looks a bit nicer. It's one simple way to hide the Zool file, just calling it index.zool, and then you don't have to add it to the URL. So the URL is already nice by a default feature provided in Tomcat. Yeah, if you need these kind of welcome files, it's in the web XML. At the bottom, you have the files Tomcat is searching for by default. So whenever any kind of folder contains the index.zool, it will load index.zool, and you don't need to do anything. You just have a nice path URL. Yeah. If I so because it loads two composers here in the index.zool. It launches the Nav composer, the navigation composer, which will deal with all the navigation specifics, and the index composer, which will just it will listen to an event in an event queue. We'll come into this later. So whenever it detects that the navigation path has changed, and that's my own event. That's the custom event in a custom event queue. I just say for my util, I'm interested in any kind of navigation event, and whenever this one is fired, I replace the current content, and I will receive my own class Nav Event. Where is my Nav Event? Oh, I haven't put it here. So my Nav Event is a very simple event that just uses or just returns a list of string as the current navigation path. I just created with a constructor. Wait, I just make it nicer. Okay, so you see, I'm just calling the super method of super constructor of event, and the data for the event is just my list of string. And when I call get navigation path, it returns the data. So very, very basic. You can put arbitrary information into your events. If you need some more contextual information when a navigation event occurs, be creative here. That's completely open, whatever the application needs. So that's the event. So the event queue will send this event. I get the path. I'm only interested in the first item here on my index page, and I put it into my URL path. And then components are created. And important, I'm passing down the whole path so that the nested components will also receive this property and can render nested components based on the next level in the path in the navigation path list. So what happens in the navigation composer is a bit more involved. Also in do after compose, I what do I have? I initialize my buttons. I just create a few buttons dynamically. You see the same items, nav, other, more. This can be data coming from a database or a config file to have a more flexible navigation here. I just hard-coded the values, and it creates nav buttons with a simple click listener, which will then, when the button is clicked, we'll call the navigate to method. It's just it means a navigate to path. And whenever I call this method, it will use the page name for the current button. So we have this list here, main, other, more. So it will just create a list that contains one item to go to this page. It's a bit backwards coded, but that's how events happen in ZK, or in general in Java. Just have event listeners, and you call another method. And here I have my navigation util, which will then magically update the browser URL. It will update the state of my navigation buttons. I could have also just re-rendered the whole buttons in a brute force way, but here I just iterate over all the buttons and disable them on demand if the name equals the active page name. So something very, very trivial. It will be more complicated in another way, but in some way I just update button enabled, disabled state. And in the end, when the navigation has happened, I post an event that navigation has changed into my navigation util. And that's basically it. And initially, what I initially do is I'm reading some. This is something we look into, how to read parameters. I check if I can find the active page or an active subpage based on request attributes. How we get these, we will look in a minute. They have defined 2 attribute names, level 1, level 2, because it's very easy to think about these. And then I build a path out of these elements. And level 1 is default is main. So when it finds the level 1 main, it will just it will navigate to the main element. And nav path is now a list that contains only a single item. And it says update the browser URL. It will update the state of the browser. Just look into what it does. Right now it's all commented out. So if we check this part, this method, it does nothing. It just switches between the pages. By default, it loads the main page. And if I click to other, it will replace the content magically. And if I enable this method to update the browser URL, we already see what it does. I say I click to other. Oh, I forgot to recompile. Okay, and I reload again. And you see it updated the URL magically. It didn't reload any page. It just updated the URL based on what I said at server side. I said push history state. Here I say push history state or replace history state. I think initially I call replace history state because I want this to be how to say, I want to change the main URL. Someone just went to SPA and I want to make clear that ideally he should have used main. So if he bookmarks this URL, he will get back to main URL, to the SPA/main. And also there's no back. If I go back, I go back to basics. So it doesn't add another item in the history. We also see here SPA main is the current item. Even though I loaded the URL SPA, we can, what did it, wait, just clear the logs again. I need to do this freshly. I say SPA, and it instantly renders the page. And in the first response, there is a call to push the history state here. Here you say it's setting history state SPA main. So that's how it updates the URL. And on any further navigation, I will add a new item to the history. So if I go to the next page to other, we see again it's replacing the content, and it's pushing another history. Where is it? It must be somewhere here. Shout at me if you see it. Here. Here's a history state. It updated the path to other. The full URL. The other. Oh, where is it? Here. So that's the new URL. And if I go to more, it displays more. And it goes even further. If I click on one of these tabs, I also have some code in place on select listener that add even more elements to the URL. So now I have a way to go back, and it does nothing because I haven't handled it yet. Oh, I broke this one. Even more. I broke something. I just start fresh. So I go to other and I go back. It goes to main. I go to other and more. And it goes back. It stays here. So must have I think I missed something. I need to check what I forgot to encode here. So, because I tested this before, so we encode URL. What else are we missing? So we have our Nav Composer. Wait, I lost my track. Subscribe to NavQ. Yeah, we want. Yeah, so I want to see this working. Maybe refresh everything now because I changed too much. Maybe in between. Just yes, I don't have the URL handler yet, because if I load the URL, it doesn't do anything. Let's see, other and go back, other and go back, other and more, go back. Somehow it doesn't like to go back from the other. There's 2 items in the list. I think I'm re-adding this every time I go to the page, so this is slightly wrong, my implementation. I'll fix this before I give you the code. It's always good when these things happen. So we have our utility class, which does the URL handling. What does it do? It also deals with our with our event queue. We have ZK has event queues internally. So if you have multiple composers in your page, you usually want to decouple these composers from each other, so you don't have to get an instance from one to the other composer. I basically just want to fire an event into a queue and listen to the changes. So if the navigation util says on navigate, there's it just publishes an event, then the rest of the application can listen to these events, or especially the on navpath changed event, to update parts. As we've seen, it updates the content, or it updates a breadcrumb view, or many other things. You can change many things, or it selects a different tab in a tab box based on these changed events. With event queues, you always need to be a bit careful that you subscribe and are also correctly unsubscribe. So maybe that's something I made wrong here, that something happens twice, that I forgot to unsubscribe somewhere. I hope I made sure that whenever the page gets detached, or whenever a component gets detached, that it unsubscribes itself. If you're using ZKEE, you can use the subscribe annotation, which will work automatically. I think you will know about this. Or if you use MVVM, instead of using the event queue directly, you can use global commands. Global commands are also very useful for this. It's doing the same thing in the background. It's posting an event somewhere and is transformed into a command. So in this case, MVVM is a bit more convenient. But we cover the basics. So under the hood, it's all using an event queue. We publish our events, and we listen to events, and whenever we get detached, we unsubscribe. We subscribe and unsubscribe from our event queue. Update browser URL, we've already seen. That doesn't do anything complicated. It just encodes the URL and updates the browser URL accordingly. So still, if there are any questions, drop them in. I assume this is maybe a little bit confusing. So what else do we have? Yep, we have, because we want to make our event, our URLs also bookmarkable. We need to do some request parameter handling or some path parsing before we redirect to a ZUL file, which can be classically done in a servlet filter, or with a servlet filter, or with another servlet that is just forwarding to a ZUL file. What I prepared here is a simple navigation parameter filter, which will really just parse 2 parameters and set them into a request attribute. Request parameters are part of a URL. These are strings, and request attributes are server-side objects in the current request objects that can be anything. It doesn't have to be a string, can be any object you derive from this. So in case you have a customer ID, you could already load your customer from a database, the customer object, and pass it into an attribute. It doesn't need to be a string. That what makes this very flexible. And especially when you use a Spring MVC, you will find lots of helpful tools there to do this. So what I do here is I just parse these two attributes and continue with the request. So we have transformed our URL parameter into an attribute. So we can use this in our page to jump into a specific page. So where did I do this? So instead of going to spa other, we just say spa SPA question mark, and then we say level 1 equals main is the one, maybe it's say other. Right now it doesn't do anything because I haven't enabled the filter. So filters are enabled in the web XML. I just enable them both, so don't need to restart. So the simple parameter filter and the nice URL filter. We'll get to this in a second. So the simple parameter filter will filter everything that starts with SPA and transform these parameters. Let's do it one by one. Sorry. Save and restart. And these parameters are really a very, very simple and effective way. If you place them into execution, into request attributes, they will be available in ZK inside the execution object and really can be anything. And this plays nicely with URL filters in other frameworks like Spring MVC when you have more complicated path patterns. So we just go here and now we use the thing level 1 equals other. Question mark. That's where you need to shout at me. Now I went to other. I put the parameter in and it replaced the URL because I said so. But right now I have these URLs that are technically bookmarkable, and I can send this URL to someone in an email. And if he clicks this URL with the parameter, it will open the other page automatically. So very simple way to have information. And also with the method set push history state, pop history state, you can also add URLs that contain URL parameters. So this is just an easy replacement. Or if you want to go to level 2 directly, we say other, we say more, and level 2 equals some more. No, even more. I think even more is the second tab, not the default tab. Just copy. Now it goes directly into the more page and opens the second tab. And we can also see here our request attribute appears here as the full path with 2 items. So very easy way to have a UI that reacts to parameters. You can access the parameters directly, but I personally find the execution attributes, not the request attributes, better because they can be any Java object, and you can add some kind of line of defense where you can filter the attributes and do some sanitization on it, because that's user input potentially, and it's good to make sure the user input is sanitized before passed into your database. Because if you use this parameter and query something from database, and it's an easy recipe for an SQL injection if you don't sanitize your URL parameters. That's why I added a filter in front of it. And inside the filter, I don't do it here, but I could do some kind of input sanitization. Make sure that this is a valid key if I had some extra information here. Okay, because I saw the time is already progressing. As always, we go to and also enable the nice URL filter. So we have the full features in place. Now, because you want to do the same thing with nice URLs. Nice URL, what it does is it's splitting the URL by slash, and based on the position of the URL, it's setting the same kind of request attributes. So I'm not depending only on the path variables. I can also use path positions. This is especially nice in what is it called? In Spring MVC, they have very nice features there to do this. It doesn't need to be re-implemented in ZK. It's already done a lot more tested and sophisticated in very popular frameworks around ZK. And in the end, as I mentioned before, I just forward to a Zool file. So everything that starts with spa will forward to index.zool, so it doesn't appear in the browser, and instead we have a nice URL. And we set the same attributes, level 1, level 2. And did I restart? I think I didn't. Just do this again. And the rest is standard ZK config, so nothing new here. So both filters will listen to the same URL, so they both capture the same items. And now if we just reload this URL, it should just work. Yeah, it just goes directly to this URL. I go to some more, it changes the URL, I reload this URL, it stays on the URL. I send this to a friend, he pastes it into his browser, opens it, and he will end up at the same page. I go to other, send this to another friend, and he sees the other page. He goes back, he's back here, goes back again. Things don't work, something I changed, something I broke just right before the training, before the session. I must have broken the back button handling, because somehow you always see 2 items in the list. There should only be 1, so it can go back. The thing is just loading the same page and setting the same, pushing the same state again on the stack. So that's something I can fix. If we go back to main other, in principle, these should work. And if we go back, now right now you see you can't go forward. If I wouldn't push this other thing on the top of the stack, I could also go forward again, and it will also work. So there's even a way to go back and forward with these URLs. Yeah, and what we've seen is, we've seen the Nav composer already. Then the index composer we've seen, it's making sure I create contents in my index.zool. So in how to say here, it's creating contents inside this div, and then I have a more page that will add these extra pages here. Now this will generate a tab box. Here I'm using a tab box with template. So in theory, I could have an arbitrary number of tab box tabs, also dynamically populated, and link into one of these tabs deliberately based on the current URL. And inside these tab panels, you have again the method to use apply or include component to include the tab content. There's just showing the nesting. And also, if you need to go back to main, you can have any other links that use the same event queue that we used before. So this is the more composer. What it does is it creates my tab box somewhere. Do you see the tab box? Update. Oh no, it uses the tab box and it sets a nav model. Here, for example, here I use selector composer. I wire my tab box. I set a model that contains the subpages, some more and even more. It will read the current navigation path from the current execution argument. Or just read some information, get the current nav path, and calls update subnavigation. And the update subnav will select the current tab in the list model for the tab box. So that whenever the path changes, the selection in the tab box changes automatically. And if I want to go back to main, I call post navigate, just send an event to my navigation util, and then everything else will just happen automatically. So you can build your nice own utility functions that help you. In my case, I want to go back to main, and if I want to go to this other page, I just create another list of more or less path elements, however complex my application needs to be. And as said, this can be any kind of object. It doesn't need to be a string. Only when creating bookmarkable URLs, you need to transform them into a string. So an account object has to become an account ID, for example, or some kind of encrypted version of the account ID if you can't share these IDs in the URLs. This is something you can create anything that you consider nice as a nice URL with these methods. Time is up. I'll just wrap up a bit more. So what did we have? We see we can use bookmarkable URLs and the back button handling using the push history state. As I somehow messed up, the back button didn't work anymore, but I will fix this in the example, and the code will in the end work. We can produce nice URLs that look nice, and we can also produce nice URLs that contain the information we need to recover the current page. We can use our event queues to post events globally around our ZK application or global commands in MVVM. And in order to do this, we just need to forward at some point. And we need to forward a URL into our Zool files in a servlet filter, in a servlet, for example, the Spring Dispatcher servlet, and it will just happen magically. Now, these path variables will also appear as request attributes in the end, I think by default. So you don't even need to do anything. You just specify a nice pattern with these URLs, and it almost instantaneously works. But it's too much for today. Okay, so that's what we have in ZK, or that are the simple techniques to do this. I hope this composes well and scales up to arbitrary complexity, because it's always the same thing. You create components dynamically based on any kind of parameter in the URL, and we set them as we need with the methods we have. So there's not a lot of API needed. In the end, you would need create components to build dynamic pages, and this one, and this one, and the pop history state, if you want to deal with changing URLs and you want nice URLs. Okay. Are there any questions? Not really. Okay, I assume this was enough for you to process right now. I will clean up the code, and yeah, the example will go out in the next few days. Just apologies for last time. We hit the number of 100 users or 100 people joining our meeting, because somehow our Zoom limit of our Zoom account can't have more than 100. So I hope no one was unhappy to just see the recording later. Okay. Then I will say thanks for joining today. There's a question. That's cool. Let's see. If you have some time left, it would be great to have some short discussion about concept with fragment navigation. What would you like to discuss? I can just say it's very similar. Instead of saying push history, you call set bookmark, and then the URL will have this fragment at the end. And whenever the fragment changes, you receive an on bookmark changed event. Also, when the page loads initially, it needs this extra round trip. First, the page renders, and then when the client engine is active at client side, it will find out there's a bookmark and then send the bookmark to the server, because this fragment is not how to say sent to the server initially.
Yeah. Okay, I've unmuted myself, so it's easier to discuss.
Yes.
Currently, we have a navigation quite similar to the subject you presented today.
Okay.
But in our application, we also have the user also has the possibility to open some floating windows and bring the application into a certain state, and all the additional options are not persisted in the URL. Only the start situation, the main topic the user has opened is in the navigation. But yeah, as we introduced the nicer URLs, user tends to navigate by just manipulating the URL. They get used on how it works.
Okay.
And start manipulating the URL, press enter, and we have a full page reload. And currently, yeah, we are thinking of switching to the fragment navigation.
Okay.
So we don't get a full page reload when the user manipulates the URL by himself.
Okay, valid case, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I was wondering during the start or during the beginning of the session, you mentioned that the fragment navigation is quite old EE or the pre-EE Internet Explorer 10 thing, and not so commonly used. So
yeah, it's just the oldest feature I know in browser URLs is, I think it's coming from the HTML 1.0 times when there were static pages and you want to navigate to a specific position inside the page with these link anchors. And it's somehow hijacked for this purpose because it doesn't reload the page. It's just something, some accidental side effect you can use to have a different URL, to have a history, to go back and forth. It still works. I think it will never go away, so don't worry about it. It's just there. Maybe I put it the wrong way around. It just means that the push history state API is not available in the past, and it's much nicer to. I would say it looks nicer. Yeah, it produces nicer URLs, and especially it produces URLs that are possible to bookmark by, I don't know. How to say it. Both are bookmarkable, but these ones can instantaneously render the page, while the hash URL fragment needs this extra round trip. It will first render the page without the hash URL, and then it will send another automatic AJAX event to the server to tell the server, hey, I found a bookmark. Now you can update. So you have this two-step rendering and maybe some flickering, or maybe displaying the wrong information first and then adding all the pop-ups later on top. But it's definitely not wrong. You can use both. They both are valid, and we are not planning to remove it. Don't worry.
Okay, that's great to hear. Because yeah, I was looking around on other applications I was seeing and meeting. And yeah, it seems there are a lot of applications still using the the fragment.
Yeah, the URL fragment. I think even Google Maps uses it. Yeah, you have it everywhere. Yeah, it's really not wrong, but it may be overloaded usage. If you want to link to a specific point in your page and encode some information in it, then it can only be one thing, because if it matches a component ID or some anchor name, it will just scroll to this position. That's why I don't like the duplicate meaning of this one, because it can have, in the worst case, a weird side effect that it's always scrolling to the wrong place just because an ID matches the string in the bookmark.
Okay, this is a good hint. We have to have an eye on, but yeah. Okay, it's good to hear that it won't be removed, and yeah.
I wonder if we can do this. If we can do this easily. If I use this ID, I think the browser will just scroll to this ID if I add this as a fragment identifier. You see, it scrolled for a second, and then it gives a null pointer exception because I don't have bookmark handler. But the first thing it does is it scrolls to this ID. If I load this thing, next one, You see the scroll position changes.
Does it really pick IDs, or I guess it needs
Yes.
a special ID anchor?
I don't know. Chrome uses the ID. I found.
Okay.
I think it's not standard. It's something convenient. In the past, I remember it uses the anchor with a name, but nowadays somehow, maybe it's just me, maybe it's just Linux. I don't know, but it somehow always scrolls to the position on my side. Yeah, so be aware of this. This has duplicate meaning, so it's really more workaround around browser limitations from the past. But if you have these specific case that your users are tinkering with the URLs, can't stop them from doing so. So this one is really then doing nothing. Okay, why? I think because I don't have a listen at server side about this one, it failed somehow. Okay, and then there was another remark. I made nice URLs with Richlets and some time before. Yes, Richlets are just another form of a URL mapping that you can do. Definitely, yes. Only that the URL mapping is, I don't know if it's dynamic. I think, yeah, you can use Richlets easily. Why not? But you don't have to use Richlets. And also inside a Richlet, you can create components. It's just a different entry point for a ZK application, but you have the same features available. You can then use the nice URLs again, or you can push history state if you want the back button handling. There are many ways to change the URLs. Okay, cool. Thanks for the interaction today. Then I'll keep the chat open for a while, so don't feel free to post more questions or recommend a topic for next time. And if we have the time, we pick it up. I say thanks for listening, and yeah, bye-bye. I'll stop the recording now.